I'm delighted to introduce this afternoon's speaker, and I think appropriate cap to this semester's activities, Demetrios Papademetriou. He's the president of and co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute, which is a Washington-based think tank dedicated exclusively to the study of international migration. He's also president of Migration Policy Institute Europe, which is a nonprofit independent research institute in Brussels that aims to promote a better understanding of migration trends and effects within Europe. He's involved in many ways in helping to shape immigration policy and the analysis of immigration patterns that informs it. He's a convener of the Transatlantic Council on Migration. He co-directs the Regional Migration Study Group, which is a joint venture of the Migration Policy Institute and the Woodrow Wilson Center that is working on collaborative approaches to migration competitiveness and human capital development for the United States, Central America, and Mexico. He's the co-founder and chair emeritus of Metropolis, an international forum for research on research and policy on migration in cities. He served as chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Migration. I could go on.
Please don't.
I won't. Professor Papademetriou, in addition to being a convener and really an intellectual hub for scholarship and policy research on migration and immigration, has published more than 250 books, articles, and monographs, including Managing Borders in an Increasingly Borderless World, Immigrants in a Changing Labor Market, Migration and the Great Recession, The Transatlantic Experience, and Immigration Policy in the Federal Republic of Germany. Today he's going to be speaking about making comprehensive immigration reform better.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you will allow me to sit down. You know, otherwise you will have a terrific advantage over me. You're sitting down and you're comfortable, and I'm standing up and I'm uncomfortable. I'm delighted to be here. All of these things that you heard, I think, are more of a function of age and longevity rather than anything else. If you do something for 40 years, you would have accomplished at least as much as I seem to have accomplished. But the topic for today is U.S. immigration reform. It's sort of like the remaining frontier in terms of trying to get the one country that hosts about somewhere between 17 and 18% all of the world's immigrants, a country that has 42 million people who are foreign-born, falling in three categories: people like me, naturalized U.S. citizens, that are about 35% of that total; people like so many other people that you know who are who have green card holders, and that's about 32%, and about 27 or so percent people who are here in an unauthorized, undocumented, etc., illegally resident, whatever it is the word that you use nowadays. Why am I starting with these statistics that most of you know? I'm starting with these statistics in order to tell you that, to make the point rather, that for a country that engages the international migration system with as much lust as we do, it is incumbent upon us to now and then try to get it right. And we haven't been able to get it right for a long time. I often use a silly analogy in order to make a very important point. Would any of you drive a car that was conceived and built in 1965, unless it was a supercar and you had done all sorts of work on it? This is essentially the system that we have. We did some things to it in 1986, some things to it in 1990, but it is a system that is creaking, that is unresponsive in all three of the dimensions that we say everyone agrees an immigration system should adhere to, and it is a system that doesn't serve anyone's interest particularly well. People profit from it. Individuals do better here than they were able to do in some of their countries, but You can't move forward in the 21st century if you do not have an immigration system that is responsive to those needs, is responsive to what the country stands for, and it is responsive to the legal obligations that our country has undertaken. And I've just given you the three basic elements that any immigration system on earth has to adhere to. And I'll repeat them. It has to adhere to international obligations. This is the refugee system. We prefer it and do it mostly as a refugee resettlement, but we also have an asylum determination system for people who come in and claim that they are prosecuted. It is supposed to respond to the values that a society has. This is sort of in general terms, in gross terms, the family immigration system. There are other reasons for which we do family immigration, but the central reason is that we fundamentally stand for the ability of families to unify and reunify. And of course the third one, and the most ignored one, is having a system that adds significantly to the economic competitiveness of the country. Builds innovation, makes us more robust, as it were, in the international game, allows some of our best firms to continue to be some of the best firms around the world, and at the same time treats people the right way. And I submit to you, I think that you probably are aware of this, and hopefully you believe this. We're not doing particularly well in any of those things. And in the past year, or so, there have been all sorts of proposals about how to do better, revive the system, comprehensively reform the system, and make certain that the system responds to all of those principles that I mentioned, and does so in a smart way. And after having looked and spent time with policymakers and testified dozens of times and written a ridiculous number of things, small, medium, and large, I must say that I'm reaching the point where I am not quite sure that the United States has the capacity to be smart on immigration. And there are lots of reasons, and I will be discussing some of them. Now, you all know, presumably you're here because you follow this immigration discussion in Washington, that we have a very large bill. I think it's about 1,300 pages. It started as 850 pages, but Congress knows how to add pages, maybe knows how to add other things. And in those 1,300 pages, there's supposed to be somewhere there, 3 or 4 or 5 or more things that it is trying to accomplish. For many people, the biggest thing that this bill is trying to accomplish is take off the table the one issue that is probably the most difficult issue. It's certainly the most emotional issue. And it's certainly the issue that if we do not resolve, we cannot move forward in the rest of the immigration reform. And that issue is the 11.5, 11.7. I think that we're all fairly comfortable, those of us who do this for a living, that the number is somewhere between 11 and 12, perhaps 11, 12 and a half million people who are here illegally. And that population, as you know, very roughly, is primarily Latino, Spanish-speaking. It will probably be, at the end of the day, somewhere between 65 and 70% of the overall population will come from the region. And as it happens with all immigration legalization, programs, we will find out that there are also very large numbers from every other place on earth. Every other person. And when I say every other place on earth, I do not just mean middle-income countries or low-income countries, but I mean every other country on earth, Japan and Germany and everybody else. So it is supposed to address this issue in a very difficult, almost tortuous way that would take somewhere between 10 and 13 years. And I don't mean 10 and 13 years from now, I mean 10 and 13 years after the bill not passes, but begins to be implemented. And you cannot implement anything until you draft regulations. And I actually served in the Department of Labor, and I had a responsibility for drafting the regulations, helping pass the 1990 Act and drafting the regulations implementing the 1990 Act from the Department of Labor, and it took us a couple of years. I left before they finished, and they got lots of things wrong. By that I mean the intent of the Congress, unless the legislation is extremely explicit, categorical, gets bent to the will and the intent of regulators. And for those of us who will be around, I hope, to see some immigration reform happen, we should keep that very much in mind, that what legislators pass is one thing, but what becomes the act that gets implemented sometimes is, let's say, is not always exactly the same thing. So there will be some sort of a legalization according to the Senate bill. The Senate bill also talks about increasing the competitive position of the United States by bringing in oodles and oodles, hundreds of thousands of some of the best and the brightest. You notice my hands. Certainly people with degrees. In one of the most excessive excesses of the Senate bill, 15,000 PhDs from anywhere in the world, unspecified in the Act, should be able to self-immigrate. That's over and above your H-1Bs and your Ls and everybody else's mother and father-in-law, friends, relatives, etc., who happen to have a PhD from just about anywhere. Now, I am sure that the regulators in this particular case will narrow the scope of this particular provision should this provision become law. Okay? But at some point, and you will feel my exasperation with the Senate bill, at some point we have to sit down and think. And this may very well be the theme of my comments today. The need to sit down and think about these things. Not you and I. We're trying our best to think, but people who make the laws up on the Hill in the Congress. The other things of the Senate, the other provisions of the Senate bill are not any less excessive. As if the United States needed an extra 5 million people today or in the next, sometime over the next 10 years, as if somehow we were hurting in terms of population. The bill would also give visas to all of the people who have been waiting on waiting lines, the backlogs. The way that the United States regulates immigration numbers is by giving people, according to certain relationships, etc., I don't want to call it the right, but let's say a possibility of coming to the United States when a visa becomes available. And that number is about 4.5 million. It may be 4 million, maybe it will not be higher than that, because as the United States does with everything else, it has no idea what it is doing. So that number could be 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5 million. It also does remarkable things in terms of border protection. in one of the most remarkable effort to simply buy votes, because that's what it comes down to in Washington, in the Congress. You know, how to sort of buy votes on a retail basis. What do you need? I need X. Okay, if I give you X, you will vote for this bill? Yes, I will. So this bill authorizes, and this is, you know, sort of too much Washington politics. Typically when a bill drafted by the committee that is responsible for an issue area, it cannot commit money. The money has to be appropriated by an appropriations committee, which means that there are two steps to the process. Well, in this particular instance, appropriations has been bypassed, and there is a commitment in the bill that there will be about 44 something billion dollars spent on additional border fortifications of all time. And you will note my, you know, bitterness and sarcasm in what I'm about to say. And in this most excessive of actions, the bill actually designates not only how much money is going to go toward what things, how many more Border Patrol agents there should be. The answer is double the Border Patrol. How much money should be toward new technology? The answer is infinite. But it also tells you how many new drones you're going to buy by model and by the actual manufacturer of each of these drones. Now, I know, you know, I'm a Washington animal, you know, sometimes I get offended, sometimes I play the game, but, you know, I shudder to think that, my God, this is how we make immigration policy in this country. And of course, there will be the same requirement plus a little bit of additional beds. In other words, how many people we need to keep incarcerated every day, in a sense. You have to fill so many 36,000 beds every day, because there's an industry out there that actually does that, etc. And on issues that really should matter to this country, particularly to the future of the country, which is how will these people who will become legalized or others who will come in under the various provisions of the bill, you know, how would they become sort of integrated? I know that there are arguments about the word. I like it. We can have a conversation why I like it. But whatever word that is that you guys use is fine with me. You know, how do you help people sort of get accustomed and meet the requirements and the expectations that the country has of them, and help them succeed through language instruction, learning our language, and becoming effective members of communities, which then leads to opportunities for the newcomers and the residents of these communities to work together toward building something better. Because if you are not about building something better, what are you in the immigration business for? If you're in the immigration business because you think immigration is a good thing and a better thing than just development aid, say so. Then we can have a conversation about that. If you're in the business of something else, say so. Let's have a conversation about that. But we're talking about what is important for the country. If we do not manage to have an immigration bill that looks at immigration in the context of many other things that need to be done in order to move the country forward, then you shouldn't even bother to be in the immigration business, at least as far as I am concerned. So, I want to make 6 points, and then I actually want to shut up and engage in a conversation, because I don't know who you are, don't know what your interests are, but you will tell me as soon as I finish. And I'll start with some fairly simple things that we can all pretty much agree on, and sort of move on to things that are a little more complex and perhaps a bit more controversial, provocative, whatever it is that you want to, you know, to call them. Not only because I like to have a conversation rather than just, you know, a monologue, but also because that I believe that it is in those latter things that the meat of a real conversation about immigration reform really is. And I'll start, as I said, simply with a no-brainer. And the simple declarative statement is that we're becoming inexorably, irreversibly diverse. And it makes no damn difference whether we stop all immigration tomorrow, and I'm talking about stopping all immigration tomorrow, all immigration, or whether we continue with about 1.1 million new immigrants, which is roughly what we're able to take every year, or we continue to take about 1.1 million plus a few 100,000 more than that in various long-term temporary visas, plus, you know, a couple of 100,000 that probably is, you know, the minimum 150,000 illegal entries, in other words, people who still continue to come in the United States illegally. So you end up with something in the 1.5, 1.6. That would be if we simply continued with the system. And we pretty much shut down the southern border. Because, you know, the border is only part of the game. The other part of the game is people who come, visit, and stay. Some of them stay innocently. They stay an extra couple of months, etc., etc. Some stay longer. Some stay, get married, do other things, and, you know, stay in the country, etc. We don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of the system because you're pretty much aware of it. In fact, we are already a universal nation. Period. So, immigration reform or not, the channels have been created. People will continue to come in all of these various ways. We'll become even more of a universal nation. I don't know whether we understand it. I don't mean you. You know, make the laws. But nonetheless, you know, this is who we are and where we are and where we'll continue to go. But moving off of that statement is where the fun starts, because then you have to ask yourself all of these questions. And this is all about asking questions. And the answers are not, you know, exceedingly difficult, but formulating the questions is perhaps a bit of a trick. Are we becoming more plural, more inclusive? Are we representing in the way that we think, in the way that we distribute social, political, economic power, or the way in which social, political, and economic power is distributed? Are we really becoming more plural? And if we're not, what are the obstacles? And if we need to overcome those obstacles, what do we need to do? Are our institutions adapting? There are realities on the ground that no one can avoid. But how do our institutions deal with this reality? If they're wanting, we need to find a way to help that process of adaptation. Are we positioning ourselves in a way partly through the immigration system? Because in some instances the immigration system is at the core of everything, and in some instances it is simply one of many variables that need to be manipulated, as it were, played with, in order to produce something else that is going to propel the country forward. And our country is not going forward all that much, or all that well. So, are we playing a leading role in terms of the international community and the world around us? And I'm not talking about military projection, I'm not talking about economic. Are we showing the rest of the world how to handle an issue which has gone south, has gone sour throughout the world? And it's not just you know, what Southeast Asians have been doing for decades. Every so often they expel immigrants. It's not just that most immigration systems are built from illegal immigration and up or out, which is the way that most immigration systems have been built. It's not just that Saudi Arabia has been deporting hundreds of thousands of people the last 6 months or so and wants to deport 2 million people. It's not just that Saudi Arabia and other people in other countries in the Middle East or whatever, you know, the Gulf states, are trying to adapt and emulate us in terms of border controls. It's not just that the European Union, within 3 months, 8 months, a year and a half, is basically trying to play with the same deck of cards that we're playing. It's not just that too much of the eastern part of the European Union and the southern part is under threat to having its politics shaped by extreme movements, extreme right movements, many of which have at least immigration or anti-immigration as one of their key components. It is all of that and more. I am convinced, as I speak to all of these people, all of their leaders, etc., that what the United States says, and what it does, and how close between what we say and what we do is, or is not, has extraordinary implications for how other people think and act on immigration. And these are not good times for international migration generally. Essentially, you have an immovable object, which is popular reaction to the rates of change, the amount of migration that has come into so many countries, and an irresistible force, which is more and more people coming in. And since most countries, you know, invest heavily in order to control a minority, a smaller, less than 50% of the immigration system, how do you develop systems that are able to manage a much larger proportion of the overall population? These are real questions. The academy is thinking about these things. What we don't have is the connection between what the academy and even people like us are thinking and how these issues are discussed in the Congress, the US Congress. The second thing I wanted to put on the table is something that I have been stunned by in a positive way, but I'm still trying to figure it out because it's, you know, it creates too much dissonance in my head, and you know, I hear all these synapses burning all the time. A mere year ago, and maybe you, I apologize in advance if you already knew that and thought of it, but about a year ago, I would never have said that somehow the debate in the United States, the narrative about migration in the United States, would have changed into a pro-immigration narrative as dramatically as it has. And I want to paint a couple of pictures. And again, doesn't mean Congress will act, but how we speak about immigrants. You will recall, I'm sorry, you don't need to recall, I will remind you that soon after President Fox took over as president of Mexico, back 13 years ago, in a policy reversal that was engineered by Jorge Castañeda, his foreign minister at that time. Many of you probably know him as a colleague. I know him as a friend. But he spoke eloquently about Mexican immigrants in the United States, and he called them heroes. I don't know if you remember that word. They were heroes. Here's, you know, successive Mexican governments that wanted to have nothing to do with its population here, and immigrants from Mexico in the United States wanting to have nothing to do with the Mexican government, and all of a sudden the Mexican government tries to embrace them. And, you know, It was just one of those phrases that in some ways has proven to be prophetic. Never would I have thought a year ago that the narrative would have changed from, if you really wanted to discuss immigration, you had to acknowledge all of the ills of immigration, to a new narrative that basically says immigrants cannot do anything wrong. Any immigrants, people here who are here illegally, people who are here in temporary statuses, etc., etc. Absolutely nothing wrong. Sometimes when I hear this narrative and how dominant it has become, I'm thinking, and I'm an average person in many ways, I'm thinking, my God, the cavalry is coming. You know, immigrants will save us economically, socially, culturally, even morally, and seemingly every other way. And maybe they will. I'm making the point, you know, of how important narratives are and how quickly this narrative has changed. Sometimes I almost feel, and here I'm going to have to say it, you know, sort of carefully, I almost feel that, you know, our friends in Washington at the Center for Immigration Studies, who used to be so dominant in terms of shaping the debate of the skeptics of immigration, now they can barely hold on. They can barely speak to those who are not just skeptics, but, you know, that they are, but the committed anti-immigration folks. How fate's turnaround is quite remarkable. Now the rearguard action is on the side of those people who want to say no, and punctuate that no, and punctuate it again. And we'll have a conversation later on to discuss how, you know, who's winning and why. But the question that I wanted to put on the table for our conversation is, can there be no juste milieu, you know, no balance, no, you know, no reasonable point, no equilibrium point in a conversation that this country has to have about immigration? You know, does it have to be either the one or the other? Do we need to in a sense, you know, jump from the one to the other? Can we have a conversation that allows us to try to figure out what is in the best interest of all of us? I know national interest is a bit passé, but let's talk about the interests of all of us as society. Do we need to work to move from one extreme reductionism? Immigrants must be doing some things that are so wrong that we ought to do something about it, to immigrants can do no wrong, to another extreme reductionism. The third question, and this hurts me a lot, bothers me a lot, not that the others didn't. What is and who is doing the second and third order thinking when it comes to all of the implications of immigration for all of us? First order thinking, piece of cake. You know, your students can do it. I'm sorry, I apologize for those of you who are students. I'm sorry, your worst students can do. Your better and best students do second and third order. So who's asking the tough questions in all of this? And more to the point, how can we ask in these broken systems that are discussed in these broken conversations, how can we ask difficult questions without being tarred and feathered? It makes no difference whether they're on this side a bit, on that side a bit. Can we have a conversation without name calling? And to make this a more practical conversation, we all sort of suspect that opening up a bit more to immigration is probably a good thing. Doing so in an orderly, smart way is a better thing. Having more people with skills coming to the United States is economically a good thing. Having immediate families reunified with their immediate family members, spouses, minor children, and all that instantly is a very good thing. And you know why I'm saying all of those things? Because every time that you have an immigration, a set of immigration rules that is stacked on the one side, and on the other side is human nature plus the market, the government loses. I don't care what the endeavor is. Yeah, of course, you know, people, here I'm going to take a slight shot at you. People in the academy say you can't shut the border. We can shut the border tomorrow. Okay, just put 44,000 border guards and 500 drones, you know, and basically you repel everyone. And yes, you put lots of technology and lots of police, and you shut down. Shut down means, you know, 100,000 will still always come in. You shut down the visa system, so in ways where people simply have to be removed. It all depends how extreme you want to get, how much money you want to spend, and what image you want to give to your own country and to other countries around the world. How they will perceive you. So all of those people will say, well, if you close it down, they'll come from under. Yeah, some people will come from under. But shutting it down is shutting it down. But is this what you want to do? Is this how you want to invest your political and physical capital? That's a question, you know, that perhaps all of us individually perhaps have to answer. If more highly skilled immigrants are good, are many, 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 many more better? Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? I know the answer to this. Okay? I'm not going to give it to you. We should be able as a country to do both things and do them a heck of a lot better than we do them. Take a specific provision of the immigration bill in order to demonstrate that second and third order thinking. One of the Senate provisions would give, I believe, within 5 years, green cards to up to 500,000 people, agricultural workers. Okay? And me, as a reasonable person, now and then, saying, these people pick our foods and vegetables, keep our prices low. The United States system is built on low, cheap labor. This way there can be cheap products, at least in terms of agriculture. They work very hard. It is now proven beyond any doubt that these jobs are anything but doable. In other words, they're very difficult. Maybe I stated it the wrong way. That the average person, that means you and I and your students, can survive somewhere between 1 and 5 days in doing that work. Furthermore, just to bring the outside world in, there is no country in the high income world and a large proportion of the middle income countries. There are two industries, two types of jobs that are done by foreigners. Agriculture and fisheries. Everywhere. So, they're essential. But maybe even it is fair to give green cards. But how will these people survive in a society that not only does not invest in people, it actually systematically disinvests from people? Who is going to pay for their education? How will they succeed as individuals? How will the communities in which they go, they move into, be able to do what is needed to bring people up to some sort of a level that make sense, particularly at a time that the economy is changing so dramatically. I'll give you an example of how dramatically the economy is changing. We have, you can count any way you like to count it, somewhere between 4 and 5 million people who are unemployed, 4 and 5 million more than they were back in 2008, and an equal number or more of people who are underemployed. And underemployment, as you know, often means a day a week. They're involuntarily in part-time employment. And yet our GDP continues to grow. Something has changed. One of the things that has changed dramatically is that the content of jobs, how you do them, what is expected, what you need in terms of the worker, has changed dramatically. As it happens in every recession, employers mechanize more, robotize more. Fewer people are needed. The need for investing and investments is dramatic. In the past 5 years, we're disinvested in terms of billions of dollars from anything that has helped people in the middle or a little below the middle to actually make it forward and upward. Our community college system. Do I need, you know all of those things. Training programs. How do you help people, particularly those who have been unemployed for a period of time, to actually find themselves back into the economy? Have families that can survive, that can grow. Let me tell you one way that you don't do this. Not by adding more people who may need more of these services. And you say, you're heartless, you're this, you're that. I am not. I think we should focus on the terms and conditions, how we pay these people, what kind of lives they live. And we should create new visa systems that allow for people to go back and forth, multi-year visas. We're not bereft of ideas of how to solve all of these problems. Washington seems to be, or at least the Congress in the way that negotiates these things among itself, however, seems to be that. I will give you the answer as to why that provision is there. Because the Senate bill is nothing but a collection of deals made by what they consider key constituencies. In the case of farm workers, it is a tiny little union that represents virtually no one, United Farm Workers Union. Lots of people, valiant people who work on justice for farm workers, and agricultural interests. That's the deal they struck. Is this what is necessarily good for the country? How much time do I have? I should have asked this. This should have, 5 to 10? Okay, 5. So let's go to the next point, because this last point is very thick. I mean, I could really spend the rest of the next 5 or 10 minutes just discussing this point. And I sort of cover the next point, which is what it is that the Senate bill, and for that matter the House, there are 5 bills in the House that have passed the committee on record. In 4 of them the Judiciary Committee, a 5th one the Borders and whatever it is committee. Are the discussions that take place in the U.S. Congress and the proposals that the one party or the other puts on the table, do they really think more broadly than just solving this immigration puzzle? It's always handled in isolation instead of thinking about the context almost as much as you think about the actual content of the legislation. One of the more radical ideas that sometimes, I'd like to punish myself with is by thinking whether immigration policy should actually belong in the Judiciary Committee. The same way that you almost have to ask the question as to whether immigration policy belongs in the Department of Homeland Security. Remember, the mothership, whatever the mothership produces, it reflects the values and the mandates of the mothership. So for all of us who may be concerned about too little or too much enforcement, too little or too much of anything, remember that if you have the function in a specific department, you will have a fairly predictable outcome. If that belonged to the Department of Labor, you would have had a different set of outcomes. And we still haven't figured out how to deal with issues that cut across a number of agencies, or for that matter, a number of committees of jurisdiction. The final point that I will make in order to finish is something that, because I do an awful lot of international work, and of course you're thinkers, and you probably do a lot of international work yourself, is again ask a question. Could we have better policy outcomes than the ones that we're likely to have if we had some real conversations with some of our neighbors? Could you have better borders, more efficient borders, tighter borders, if you had conversations with people from the neighborhood? Is it necessary for us, and I'm going to pick a country, I'll pick two countries, this way I can offend my country of birth as much as I can offend the other country. Should we be bringing in Greeks and Bangladeshis here to do some of, let's say, the seasonal work in the United States? Repetitive kinds of tasks. If we have all of these people in the region who can do these jobs and can do them much more efficiently, people who have relationships here, and after 2 or 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, we give them an opportunity to actually get a green card in the United States. Are there any other ways of doing this except the way that we do it? My final comment, and it's not a question, is that I have been a bit unfair here. I seem to be throwing rocks at people who have a very difficult job, legislators, people who realize that the only way that this issue can get forward is by cutting deals, people who perhaps, maybe, hopefully, think almost as hard about immigration and its place in the future of this country as we do in this room and elsewhere, but people who also realize that you got to get the votes to pass anything. Maybe at the sort of the core of our failure in terms of getting an immigration system that works for the country is the way that we make legislation, the way that we have organized ourselves. That is why an awful lot of other countries are leaving us behind in terms of their ability to actually come up with smart ideas. One of the things that I would love as an analyst and as a practical person would be for the United States to be curious enough about the effects of its policy. In other words, suppose we pass legislation tomorrow. Good, bad, or indifferent. Shouldn't we also ask ourselves, require ourselves, to evaluate that immigration policy, test it against the goals that presumably a new immigration system sets for itself, and find a way to change what doesn't work and shore up further what does work without having to go through another decade of arguments about numbers, about who is coming, about more border controls, about fewer border controls. It is incumbent upon a country that plays in the immigration game with the gusto that we do to be curious about the effects of its policies and to build into the system the ability to adapt, evaluate, learn, have a feedback loop, and change the darn system. And if we can do that, I would almost say we don't deserve an immigration system that will be better than the immigration system that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the spirit of Dr. Papademetriou's question, how can we ask difficult questions and engage in second and third level thinking about immigration? I encourage us to do that in the next half an hour or so. And so we have a floor open to questions. And so if you can please identify yourself when you speak up. And you want to call on me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
I mean,
great.
and my name is Dimitri, incidentally. Dr. Papademetriou was a long time ago. Please.
My name is Paul Gilbert, and it seems that people migrate from native lands not primarily because it's a fun idea, but because they're escaping desperate conditions. They believe that they're likelier to eat and have basic needs met, and likewise for their families if they migrate far from where they would prefer ordinarily to be. And so it seems as though the question has to do with if we seek to restrain desperate wandering around the globe to address economic policy. People are escaping stultifying and repressive economies where elites who control the land, the law, and the money squeeze them out of the game. So there, at very least, I would imagine an endorsement of the Tobin tax, which is a small, a microscopic tax on each stock market transaction, and that could be plowed back into the microeconomies in each of these countries, and increasing in our own.
There are so many different ways that you can actually find money to do what it is that you're saying. The Tobin tax may be one of them. Of course, every time that you talk to anybody who controls these taxes, they have an entirely different mindset as to what they should do with them. And every time that you try to put migration as migration, international migration, to the agenda of the development agencies, here or everywhere, I can assure you, I talk to policymakers and testify in parliaments and advise people in 20, 30, 40 different countries. And when you talk to development ministers or state secretaries or director generals, they say, no. Okay, we want to build infrastructure. So my latest sort of attempt, particularly I was in Switzerland this week and 2 weeks ago in Norway talking to people about some of these ideas, is that, okay, I'm not telling you to just not give all the money that you give to all of these projects that you do, but you're rich countries, okay, you have vast development funds available. Just add another 3% to the damn thing and make those 3% focus on the things that really matter. And I will tell you, although educational reform is one of the things that they do like to do, the fact is no one is thinking about how you build from the bottom up, create opportunities for people, because ultimately development will happen. Okay, China development will happen differently and all that, but in most places development will happen from the individual up, building, the human capital of people. This way they can do better for themselves, for their families, for their households, for their villages. This way, migration will not be this act of desperation that it often is, at least in the United States, people who try to come to the United States. And we know that several hundred people lose their lives per year. That's a thing that nobody's even paying attention to any longer. I mean, 15 years ago, if you had 3 people die in the desert, or 3 people drown, in wherever, Rio Grande, it would make the news. Now you need to have real numbers before you would get some attention in the local news outlets, and never in the national news outlets. In Europe, where the numbers are the deaths are much higher, you need to have hundreds of people die, and hundreds of people die twice in a week, and 3 times if you include the 90 or 100 people that they found in the Sahara Desert within, again, the same week or 10 days, before people begin to pay any attention to these things. And we're talking about the United States. I could go into a tirade about European thinking in that regard, but I won't unless you make me to. So there are investments that can be made that will certainly reduce the need for people to take those desperate measures. It will take a long time. One of the best antidotes to this, in addition to development aid and all that, is implied in the rest of your question, which is building institutions, getting countries and their resources out of the grasp of, what did you call them, the elites' squeeze, the squeeze of the elites and things like that. These are important things. It doesn't mean that they are much easier than anything else that we have to do. And in some instances, we're seeing some progress. In the same way that you talked about helping people and I talked about human capital, the one thing that gives me some hope is the rate of growth of the middle classes in many of the countries in the region, Mexico, and throughout the world. Middle classes, among the many demands that they make on their own leadership, whatever, demand institutional reforms that will guarantee that their middle class status will be maintained, which creates all sorts of other virtuous cycles that can make a big difference over a period of 10 or 15 years. So I hope that if you build human capital and you continue to have economic policies that make sense and you reform institutions, then you begin to have some of the elements that are needed in order to stop this mindless way of trying to come to other countries. I'm sorry, I had seen someone, who was the, okay, you were second. Maybe you can help me because there are hands in many different places. Just bring your chair right here. Thank you. Yes.
I'm Howard Chang. I teach immigration law at the law school here. And I was surprised to hear you speak so critically about the Senate bill, which, as you say, is going to involve political compromises and concessions of special interests, such that nobody's going to be happy with all of the elements that they get in that kind of package. But if the choice were between the Senate bill and the status quo, my question to you is, would you vote for it or against it?
Boy, how can I avoid having to answer this question? Let's see if I still have any mind left. I will say that I am very glad that we do not have an up or down vote on the Senate bill. Okay? In other words, for me, having the House vote and going to conference under what it is that people were pushing for back in June, July, August, September, October, November. At least now they've stopped that. Okay? It would have been not a particularly good outcome for us. The Senate bill is the most awkward, excessive thing that I have seen in a long time. The interesting thing about the Senate bill is that it has taken an awful lot of good ideas. 12 of those ideas are our own ideas, Migration Policy Institute ideas, and it has made them almost unrecognizable. I'll give you an example. Okay? One of the things that we've been pushing for since, I don't know, 2006 or 2007, we've written papers, testified, you know, we don't lobby, but they always invite us for private meetings up on the Hill, members, not their staff, is to actually be more curious about the system, to have, you know, some sort of a bureau that basically looks at these issues and recommends changes to immigration law, and it does so in an efficient way. Okay? So it appeared in the 206 legislation, 207 legislation, it appears in the 213 legislation in an unrecognizable fashion, because certain elements in the business community, probably the bar too, don't like the idea that somehow, you know, you should have a system that makes sense, because, you know, it may come up with recommendations that are not in the interest of some small employers in some small or in some interest group. They have created it, or they would have created. They put it in the this, you know, USCIS, the Citizenship and Immigration Service, and they make it one of several inputs that would write some sort of a report that Congress may ignore. That's not how you become curious about immigration policy. That's not how you accomplish what it is that you say that you need to accomplish with immigration. Not. Emphatically not. So, to answer your question, after all this very long prologue, I would not vote for the immigration bill. If I were a member. I'm not a member, so I'm completely irrelevant. I can say that.
My name is Amy Wax. I also teach at the law school. And,
oh boy. Can I go now or what? Just joking.
Right. Well, I think the skepticism about immigration reform or substantial immigration on the blogosphere and in the heartland has many, many sources. But just to look at one, I mean, I think one is the notion that not drawing a sharp distinction between illegal and legal immigrants and not controlling illegal immigration and then channeling immigration through legal channels shows a disrespect for sovereignty and law. So sort of ripping off your skepticism about border control, I guess I would ask you, how would you design an effective system of border control? Do you think we are entitled as a nation to have an effective system of border control and to enforce the distinction between legal and illegal immigration? How would you structure that distinction?
Right. Amy, thanks for asking this question. I may have implied the wrong thing. I'm one of the strongest advocates of border controls. I also happen to be one of the strongest advocates of smart border controls. I'm also an advocate of not wasting money. So how would I do it? I would do it through a combination of means. I would work much more closely with the neighborhood. I would channel a lot of the new visas that inevitably will become part and parcel of any legislation. You know, Senate errs, you know, remarkably in favor of high skills and is very, very skeptical about lower skills. And finally, the U.S. legislation, as proposed, maybe as the House will also propose, maybe as it will come out, is beginning to show the slightest recognition that the biggest need for new visas will be in what I call the middle skills. It liberates us from this tyranny of the high end, which is not really high end, and the low end. And it creates opportunities, very small opportunities, to actually have visas wherever they are needed. So I will be in favor of mechanisms that tie visas to needs that are identifiable and clear, that people can see. I would work on wages and working conditions. I would work with my neighborhood, and I would make it, as part of, a deal with the neighborhood where most of these new visas for the middle and lower skills would give a first preference to people from the region. And I would eschew the doubling of the border patrol. For so many practical reasons, we could spend the rest of the afternoon. Let me give you just 2 or 3. Even if you had all the money in the world, and 44 billion may look like all the money in the world, but it's not. You couldn't double the border patrol if you tried it. Okay, you can't train them fast enough, you cannot retain them, and I don't like wasting money on symbolism. I don't like buying votes, with billions of dollars per vote. Strong borders, yes. Smart borders, even more important than strong borders, because smart borders make borders better. And I would pay an awful lot of attention on a system that basically conveys to the world that our country is in control of immigration, in charge of who comes in and under what circumstances. And you do this by changing policy and by evaluating policy on a regular basis. The last person I've ever been associated with is soft borders or no borders. This is not in my blood. I don't do that. I have written extensively, and I've gotten an awful lot of flack from people who think that I am, a hardliner on borders. And I must have, not conveyed what I meant to say clearly.
Yes, back. Yep.
Hi, thank you for that. I did have to come in a little bit late, so apologies if you did cover this, but one of the things that seems extraordinarily complex, in addition to all the very complex issues you laid out, is the relationship that now has to exist between the sort of flourishing of state and municipal immigration policies and whatever policy reform ends up happening at the federal level. And because of the constitutional questions around whether states and municipalities can actually even pass immigration law, of course, they all go through the court system, and different federal judges have had different rulings about various ones. Of course, the Arizona law went all the way to the Supreme Court, but there are other laws even more draconian than that one, including the one in Alabama, that seem to have got very little even press attention, that it has been implemented in the state of Alabama. So how do you see, so I guess 2 questions, tough questions you asked. How do you see those state laws influencing debate and policy making at the federal level, number 1? And number 2, if federal immigration reform actually happens, how do we, because part of our broken immigration system now is this policy at various levels that aren't in dialogue really with each other in many ways, although in some ways they aren't.
Thank you. I didn't mean that you should ask me hard questions, guys. Come on. It's Friday afternoon. Sometimes, we say things that we don't mean. I'm fairly sure that, and just to show that the Senate bill is not, full of sort of exaggerated or misguided ideas, at least, in how they present them. And one of the things that it does, it basically reinstates, in the legislation, federal control over the issue. So, and I haven't looked at the bill since it stopped being 866 pages. So I can't tell you that I am 100% or 1,000% right on this. But between the Supreme Court decision and the the fact that at least the Senate leans in the direction, and I suspect, there's going to be a battle royale between whatever the House says and ultimately, how the Senate may feel about this. I think that already you see, already you see a pullback on the part of the states and localities from some of the things that they were doing 2 and 3 years ago. I suspect that all of those things have flourished as a result of the failure of the larger system and the opportunities that that creates for opportunists at the state and local level. And I think one of the most sort of clear ways in which you can sort of stop these kinds of things is, by passing legislation. I don't know how much more, I don't know whether it will continue to be profitable for local politicians and state politicians to continue to push these ideas, at least to push them to fruition. In other words, to actually pass legislation and implement it. We certainly have reached the peak, and with legislation we may actually get to a point where that is no longer one of the issues that preoccupy us.
Yes.
One small question and one larger one. First of all, thank you. And we are the Bergson Shilcock, the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvania.
I know.
We're big fans of the migration policies. First of all, there's an integration title in the Senate bill. Do you think there is any chance that the House would consider that integration title as a standalone bill? And then secondly, a broader question, which has to do with the nature of citizenship. And it seems to me that there are two opposing things going on in the world right now. One is the revocation, which we saw in the Dominican Republic, of citizenship vocations. And on the other hand, we see this increasingly mobile class of college-educated people who are very transnational. So, big question there. Citizenship is going in two different directions.
Wow, I love the question. It's exhausting, but I love it, both of them. I will say something now again about the Senate bill. When various senators, including 2 of the group of 8, were asking us to talk to them about these issues, what they wanted to know is whether this was going to cost any money. As soon as they heard that you can't do anything without money, yeah, it's okay, $44 billion, mere change. But this, it wasn't really going to do it. But there is a bill that I am told, because some of my colleagues have been working very hard at this, that is about to be introduced, that is a real integration bill that invests on things that really matter, including creating an office of a national office of integration, possibly even what the MPI, Migration Policy Institute, has asked for, which is at the White House, to show you another one of those, interesting things that happen, in the Senate bill. They would put some sort of they would give a commissioner or something for integration and put it at USCIS. Useless. No money, no power. In Washington, like in every other city, and in war, money and people, staff matters. In the absence of a lot of money and people, where you put the function matters even more. You coordinate these things at the highest level, or you don't have them. So I was told yesterday, I was actually Margie Mathieu, who heads this effort on our part, gave me a gentle smack at a meeting that we had with a whole bunch of people for not, understanding how close this particular separate integration bill is. On the bigger question, here is where I put my sort of either 3D glasses on, or I bring along my crystal ball. the way that this, whatever you want to call it, field, the reality, the way that things happen on migration and the rate at which they are happening, conversations about citizenship and things like that are not going to be the conversations we're going to be having 15 years from now. But between now and the next 15 years, we're probably going to be at each other's throat about citizenship. And citizenship is going to bifurcate. People who want us, who come to us, in other words, what we still call immigrants, will want citizenship. And in countries like the United States, where citizenship protects you, it used to be that citizenship offers you certain advantages. Now citizenship protects you from the overreach of government. Okay? It has changed. It's an instrumental thing. It's not a value thing. I know politicians talk about civic this, etc., etc. Talk to the people who take the citizenship, even when they cry, for the pictures at the citizenship ceremony. They know that the only way that they can be protected against the government changing the law, doing whatever it is by becoming U.S. citizens. So the people who choose us, as I say in international events, will continue to play by those rules. The people whom we choose will have less and less interest in citizenship. And this is a broader question about citizenship more generally rather than citizenship just in the United States. So if we were to double and treble the number of high-skilled immigrants that we take in, I think it would be highly improbable that many of them, even if they actually take on our citizenship, will be the traditional immigrants who will come, work, have children, have families, retire, and die here, which incidentally has been always a historically wrong. Okay? So that's the answer about citizenship. I thank you for the question. It gets me excited.
We have time for two more quick questions. I'm going to ask you two have had your hand up. The guy in the orange and the woman in the gray have had your hands up since the beginning. So ask your questions quickly, both of them, and then Demetriou will answer and we'll call it an afternoon.
All right. You mentioned a lot about how before we think about a lot of the various specific things in the Senate bill, we have to think about building communities, and that from the bottom up. You said that has to be the original focus. And that reminded me a lot of an article in the Metro section of the New York Times a couple months ago, which described a Chinese-American community in Queens, where there was essentially one person who would become the leader of the community because he happened to be very, very good in English when he came here about 5 years before a lot of the other people in that community. His job as part of the community was to liaise with the law, whether it was the actual police department or the court system or even education officials. He was the leader of the community because he was the one who knew how to connect that community, which was still largely non-citizen immigrants, with the current systems that were in place in the United States to help people of their income level, to help people in that community. And my question is, how do we expand that so it's not just one community with one person on whom they rely personally to interface with the current services that the U.S. government currently wants to provide these people? And how do we put the people who are currently eligible for services in the United States in contact with the services that will allow them to help build up their communities, which will in that case create more opportunity for everyone?
And then last question.
And my question has to do with some of the questions that have already been asked. Because we had a group of immigrants demonstrating yesterday, Mexican immigrants in the city of Philadelphia demonstrating in front of the offices of ICE, and they were asking for immigration reform. And what they want is not all of the provisions that are in that bill. They want basically protection against deportation. And so my question could be formulated as, where is Obama, where is the White House, where is the executive in the midst of all this? And where is his advisor, Cecilia Munoz, who has disappointed the world so much?
From Queens to Philadelphia, to the Oval Office, we will leave it to Demetriou to come up with a brilliant answer that weaves them all together.
Brilliant question. It happens first in New York, everywhere. every time things happen in New York first. Maybe because the city treats newcomers with aplomb. Maybe because, you know, they've had a mayor in the last, whatever, 12 years, and he invested at least the last 6 years in this new pen to immigration. Maybe because communities are organized there. Maybe because there are over 200 organizations that serve the interests of all immigrants. Some of them can actually make an enormous difference with the city council and in getting money out of both the state government and the city government. I'll give you an example. After many years of fighting in New York, right before the recession, and I haven't followed it through since then, so I can't tell you whether it's still true or not, the state finally succumbed and committed over $500 million, okay, to education services. New York, earlier than anybody even imagined, you know, has had a requirement of interpreters, you know, at everything, schools, hospitals, etc., a legal requirement. And only about a month ago, the city council committed $18 million to try to understand better and get out the DACA kids, you know, and get them to actually be able to participate. New York has always been in the forefront of those things. But many other places, this happens to be an article about New York, there is always an intermediary or a group that actually does this connecting, if you will, this negotiating, because it's all about negotiating in order to create sort of new realities. And it happens mostly in the big cities. You know, Seattle now is ahead of New York in so many different ways, remarkably so. In other words, you know, I can go on and on. It's a great question. It's happening, but it's not happening in Alabama or in Mississippi or in or about, you know, whatever, the bottom third of the country. And we have to pay attention to that, because that's where the institutions that negotiate and create a new relationship between newcomers and the community are the weakest, because they are the newest. The newest. They're 10 or 15 years old if we're lucky, because immigration there is a very recent phenomenon, and because most of the immigration in the South, sort of, you know, I don't know, from Arkansas and below, whatever, is illegal immigration. So there's a lot of work to be done, which takes me to your question. When I spoke so obliquely perhaps about the narrative, and I only focused on the narrative, you know, I could expand that part of the conversation and say one of the other things that has changed, and there is a chicken and egg relationship between narrative and these kinds of actions that you're talking about, is essentially, you know, people come in and say, you know, if you mean what you're saying, you should stop the deportations. Just to prove the point that, you know, I actually am a hell of a lot more of a rule of law person than perhaps I gave you the impression, simply because I recoil from some of the provisions of the Senate, or at least how they turned out. I don't think the president, and the president knows that, I don't think the president has the authority to do that. Now, we could have a fight about this, not you and I, okay? And we can have an impeachment proceeding against the president, which will stop any other activity. I'm not talking about immigration, any other activity in the second 4 years of the president. But as some of you know, we wrote, you know, the 6 administrative actions that can be taken that are within the authority, the prosecutorial discretion authority of the president. This is not one of them, okay? This would be ultra vires. It would be violating the law, okay?
There seems to be an aggressive way.
I didn't say it's not an aggressive, and You know, maybe there will be slices, you know. I mean, remember, in the last month alone, the administration has been fairly smart in what it chooses, where it chooses to actually open up and take chances with. So, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the choice was that people who are in the U.S. military forces and their families, regardless of legal status, would now be able to become permanent residents. Okay? The argument, the political calculation is that nobody would dare pick a fight with the president over this. Okay? So there are other possible ways in which you're going to have, you know, some, you know, sort of tinkering at the edges, but it's going to be mostly at the edges. And this is a very, the White House part of the question, a very, very cautious president. He talks, you know, very strongly and eloquently, etc., but if you look at the content, it's always about trying to motivate Congress to pass laws. Okay? At the same time, there's enormous pressure on the White House and on the team that manages immigration reform, which is not some sort of a team buried here. I mean, you know, the director of the Domestic Policy Council is in charge of that, and as you all know, she's, I mean, that's her issue. Cecilia Munoz is, you know, I mean, more than anything else, when she got the job, when she accepted the job under, you know, a clear understanding that she was going to be the person that would handle immigration reform. And now that she has the right title too, she's trying her best. But they realize that they are in between another rock and a hard place. Okay? And the Republicans would love nothing better than to have another issue on which they can say, you see, this president will not enforce the law. And if you cannot persuade some Republicans that whatever it is that they write will actually be enforced, they're not going to vote for immigration reform.
Well, on that sobering note, thank you very much for a really